Hey guys, this is Kate from Abidible.com, and you're listening to the Abidible Podcast. I'm just a regular wife and mom who's had my life transformed by learning to study the Bible on my own. If I can, you can. On this show, I help you know and love God more by abiding in Him through His Word yourself. So we are kicking off today's episode with a special guest that's never been on the podcast before. I invited my 11-year-old son, Liam, to answer a question for me this morning. He doesn't know what the question is, so this is totally impromptu. I wanted to ask you what you do not like about rides in the dark at Disneyland.
First of all, hey everybody, it's good to see you and get to talk on here. All right, we can get into the questions like Mama said. The reason I do not like dark rides is because, like, on Space Mountain, it's just, you can't see anything, and then all of a sudden it's just a surprise and you're not prepared for it, and I just don't like being surprised like that. I would rather it, like, if Space Mountain was in the light, I would do it no matter what, but you can't see anything in the dark, and then all of a sudden you just go, and you drop.
So it's the unexpected, the unknown in the dark that you don't like.
Yes.
If you knew what was coming, like you said, if it was light enough to see what was ahead, and if you knew what was coming, then you would be willing to do the drop, the scary part?
Yeah, like if it was like in the light, like have you ever seen those videos where it shows it and where it's all in the light?
Like when they show a Space Mountain video where all the lights are turned on and you can see all the
Yeah, then it's just a pretty fun coaster to just go on.
So if the lights were turned on, you would be willing to do, for example, Space Mountain.
Yeah, the drops are not too bad, but it's just scary because it's in the dark and you're unexpected to know.
How cute is my little buddy? He loves talking into the microphone, so I'm sure he'll be back on the podcast. Okay, so you heard him. My son is not a fan of fast rides in the dark. If the lights are on inside Space Mountain, he'd ride it. If the lights are off, as they normally are, nothing could convince him to get on that roller coaster. Why? Because the dark can be scary. What's the main reason that the dark can be scary? Things are hidden and therefore unfamiliar in the dark. You can't see where you're going and you don't know what to expect. This is where we pick up the story with Israel. Last week, we studied Isaiah 9:1, and we learned that because of their extensive rebellion against the God who loved them, consequences were coming. And though we learned last week that the punishment wouldn't last forever, it doesn't make it any less severe. The kingdom of Assyria was coming to carry off some of the northern tribes of Israel, beginning with Zebulun and Naphtali. Understand something very unpleasant here. The Assyrians didn't come politely to knock on doors. GotQuestions.org says that the Assyrians were known as a fierce and cruel nation who showed little mercy to those they conquered. 1 Kings 19:17 says that the kings of Assyria laid waste the nations and their lands. Hosea goes into even more brutal detail in chapter 13, verse 16. Israel's little ones would be dashed in pieces and their pregnant women ripped open. If you have heard anything about the horrors that took place last year on October 7th in Israel, then you've had a glimpse of what Israel was facing in the 8th century BC. The Assyrians were brutally violent, and many Israelites would be assaulted, wounded, or killed during this invasion. And the land most severely ravaged by the Assyrians, because they were most exposed to their invasion from the north, would be Zebulun and Naphtali. Once conquered, most of those who remained would be carried off into exile. Where would they be taken? Into unfamiliar darkness. Israel was facing a horrifying new future. They were about to get what they thought they wanted, a new identity through Assyrian assimilation. Remember, they wanted to be like the other nations around them, and so they willfully chose to rebel against their God, despising him and his statutes, and even burning their children in the fire like the nations around them. Their practices had become detestable. Despite God's numerous warnings and his loving appeals, Israel simply didn't want to be his any longer. So he gave them what they wanted, a new identity as a people now separated from their God, plucked up out of the promised land he had given them, no longer under his powerful protection and outside of his perfect provision. Now they would both walk and dwell in darkness. The lights were turning off. Everything up ahead would be hidden by the darkness. Israel no longer knew what to expect or even what to hope for. The darkness would be unfamiliar and absolute. Has your life ever felt like this? I'm going to ask you for a moment to think about the darkest place you've ever been in your life. And as you do, know that I'm thinking of mine. In fact, last night I had a dream about that exact season of darkness. My dream put me smack dab in the middle of that horrendous season, and I woke up trembling, having to shake myself out of it. It felt so real. So I don't have to think too hard about how dark that darkness felt because I relived it last night. It's awful, isn't it? As you're thinking of your own darkness, and in light of what we're learning about Israel's darkness, let me now read you Isaiah 9:2. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. Light is coming. But before we get there, we need to spend a moment more in the dark. There are important things for us to see here, even though right now it feels incredibly unpleasant and scary. Israel had a problem several millennia ago, and we still do today. This problem is called sin, and it turns out all the light. So much so that we find ourselves completely in the dark. No matter how much God did for Israel, no matter how much he loved and instructed and led them, their hearts simply could not and would not obey. They kept forgetting God and all he had done and said to them, and instead chose to chase after the gods of the nations around them. They were the people who rejected the opening words of Isaiah in chapter 2, verse 5. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. They didn't want to walk in the light of the Lord. Because of their sin, they instead chose to walk and dwell in darkness. In Isaiah 9:2, there are actually two different words in Hebrew in this one verse that are used for darkness. And alongside those two words used for darkness, there are two verbs or action words. First, we have the people who walked in darkness, and then we have those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness. What does that mean? Let's look at the first phrase, walked in darkness. Here, walked might be summarized as the manner in which one lives their life. And this word for darkness actually has a lot of figurative meaning behind it. Here, darkness can mean misery, destruction, death, ignorance, sorrow, and wickedness. So we've got a people whose entire manner of life, their going and their coming, is in misery, destruction, death, ignorance, sorrow, and wickedness. Have you ever lived the entire manner of your life in this way? I have. My going and my coming, my walking and way of living have been entirely characterized by darkness in the past. And this is not just before becoming a Christian. I've had seasons where I've hidden from godly people and from God himself because I wanted to do things my way. I was living for self, attempting to shove God off the throne so that I could take what I saw as my rightful position. I've pursued careers for selfish motivations and used people to make me feel better about myself. I've allowed my heart to become an idol factory, worshiping things and people other than the one true God. I know what it is to live my entire manner of life in darkness. Do you? The second phrase says, those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness. Dwelt here means to remain, sit, stay, to have one's abode. If you did the Psalm 23 study with us, you'll recognize this word. It's the same word David used when he said, "I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." There's a permanence here with this word. This is the idea of settling in and getting comfortable. But in this chapter, we're not talking about dwelling in the house of the Lord. We're talking about dwelling in deep darkness. You might also recognize this word for deep darkness from Psalm 23. This word is the same word David uses for the valley of the shadow of death. This is a land of deep darkness, which is characterized by death, distress, calamity, and extreme danger. This is our problem. Our sin is no small thing. It plunges us into the deepest depths of darkness. We don't just pass through. Sin is the manner in which we live our lives. It's who we are. We snuggle up to it, get comfortable. We say, "Hello, darkness, my old friend." We are carried off by it to live in a dark land of misery, ignorance, sorrow, and extreme danger. What happens to people who walk and dwell in darkness? I've only been to Alaska once, and it was the wrong time of year to experience their crazy long dark days. But I did some quick research and found a Fox Weather article that investigated the effect of Alaskan winters on its population. Here's what the article said. For about 2 months surrounding December's winter solstice, the sun barely peaks above the horizon in Alaska. In fact, the northernmost city in Alaska, whose name I can't pronounce, has near constant darkness from mid to late November until late January because the sun never rises during that 60-day period. The wintertime darkness is difficult to cope with every year. It does tend to have a negative effect on a number of people. Some people use happy lights, also known as light therapy lamps, to help brighten the mood on a cold, dark winter's day. Very few people celebrate the shortness of days in winter and instead count the days until normal daylight returns. I've had some really dark Pacific Northwest winters. The gray has rolled in on me and dang near suffocated me. A heaviness, often seemingly too big to bear, would settle in over me like a gloomy cloud. The simplest tasks would be impossible. All I wanted to do was stay in bed. Have you ever been there? People plunged into darkness suffer tremendously. No wonder they count the days until normal daylight returns. Thankfully, Israel was not going to be in the dark forever. Isaiah 9:2 tells us, "The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone." Last week, we recognized that the impending judgment Israel was facing was both proportional and purposeful. God was rightly responding, as promised, to Israel's sin, and he was doing this as a just, righteous, and loving Father. He had purpose in the discipline to turn the hearts of the people back to him, and there would be a limit on the discipline. It wasn't going to last forever. Something was going to change. We were able to figure out where it was going to change. Gloomy Zebulun and Naphtali would become glorious Galilee, and we were able to see why. Glory. God would lay the groundwork for his glory at ground zero for gloom. But we weren't yet told how God would accomplish this. Now we are told here in verse 2, light is coming. Isaiah is writing specifically about that coming light. But remember, this is prophecy. He is writing about an event that wouldn't happen for some 700 years. Imagine how familiar the dark would become to the exiled Israelites over the course of 7 centuries. The people would grow so accustomed to the darkness, they would forget all about the beauty of light. Save a remnant of faithful Israelites, which God did preserve, the majority of this people wouldn't remember how life used to be when they walked with their God in the light. Darkness would become an old, familiar friend. Some of us have been walking or dwelling in darkness for so long that we've actually grown to love the dark rather than the light. When it comes to our fallen human nature, we're actually the opposite of my son. We want the lights out on this ride. Why? Well, darkness hides sin, and we're sinful and fallen beings from the moment we take our first breath. Think about a toddler's first inclination to lie or to disobey, and then what? Hide. To sneak things they're not supposed to eat or take things that don't belong to them. To lay hands on other children and to fight with their siblings for what they want. Sin doesn't have to be taught to a child. It's as natural as breathing. We were meant to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, and might, and to walk in the light. But instead, we love the dark. John 3:19-20 says this exact thing. The people loved the darkness rather than the light because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light, lest his works should be exposed. What are we to do? Sit back and let the light shine on us. The light was coming, not because Israel had the ability to turn it back on, or even because they earned its glorious return while in exile. In fact, just the opposite. They had no power to shine light and had not done anything to deserve a spot in its brilliance. And yet, they would see a great light, and on them, light would shine. Here we see something incomprehensible about the character of our God. In darkest night, even when we've brought the darkness upon ourselves, He is close like no other. When the light of God turned back on over Israel, just as when God shines His light on us now, we discover something astounding. Once the lights are turned back on, we realize that even in the dark, He was right there beside us all along. Think about that lyric from the song Goodness of God. Here it is in context. I love your voice. You have led me through the fire, and in darkest night you are close like no other. I've known you as a father, I've known you as a friend, and I have lived in the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful, and all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God, 'cause your goodness is running after me. What can we now see here in the light? The covenant-keeping God upholding His promises. He would not completely write off His children because He could not completely write off His children. He had made a promise. He would still make a way for the nations to be blessed through Abraham. He would keep His promise by doing something new. He would stay with Israel even in exile, chasing after them. He would remain close like no other, even in darkest night. And He would do something entirely new and profoundly necessary. Israel had a sin problem they could not fix on their own. Oppression and darkness had become their fast, familiar friend. But God. The dark was never going to be permanent. Even though it's what Israel had chosen, God was going to do a new thing. Consider Hebrews 8:8-12. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, and so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. As an aside, this is the part where He stepped back and let them experience the harsh consequences of their rebellion, right? Hebrews 8 continues, For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful toward their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more. The light was coming to shine on the people who walked and dwelt in deep darkness. God's law would now be put into his people's minds and written on their hearts. He would be merciful and remember their sins no more. Somehow, they would all know the Lord, from the least to the greatest. The deeper the darkness, the brighter the light. Yes, light was coming. But what, or should we say who, was the light? We'll be right back after this message. Is there anything more delicious and cozy than lighting a yummy smelling candle in the middle of a dark winter night? Now that it gets dark at like 1 p.m., I love lighting a candle or two in our home. For the first time ever, Abidible has partnered with a small business that makes 100% natural soy wax blend scented candles. These candles are vegan, completely natural, and non-toxic. They contain no lead, plastics, parabens, synthetic dyes, or phthalates. These 9-ounce candles are lettered with verses from our A Child is Born study in Isaiah 9 and come in 2 yummy scents, cinnamon vanilla and Christmas warmth. Bundle and save when you order more than one, plus pay one flat $5 shipping charge no matter how many candles you purchase. What better time to tell you about these candles than in this episode about darkness and light? Be reminded each time you light them about the great light of God that has shone in the hearts of men. And now, back to the show. Light was coming. But what, or should we say who, was the light? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. That's who was coming. One of our cross-references for Isaiah 9:2 is 2 Corinthians 4:6. This verse connects us all the way back to the very beginning. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. They won't have to teach their neighbor saying, "Know God," for they all shall know him. How? Light. The same God who said, "Let there be light," and who separated light from darkness would shine the face of Jesus Christ into our dark hearts. Where? Zebulun and Naphtali, ground zero for gloom, anguish, and contempt. Why? Glory. How? The light of God himself in the face of Jesus Christ. We're going to get into this even more in verse 6, for to us a child is born, as you can imagine. A baby is coming, and his arrival is no small thing. But for now, let's fast forward even further. Not just 700 years to his birth, but about 30 more years to the beginning of his public ministry. This baby is obviously Jesus, and we're picking up at the point where he's grown into an adult and has begun his ministry in Capernaum, near Galilee, remember, right at ground zero for gloom, in the dark region of Zebulun and Naphtali. The way of the sea would be made glorious by the light that would forever shine from its shores for all nations. What does Jesus tell us about who he is and why he came? Jesus spoke to them, saying, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." In John 12:46, Jesus says, "I have come into the world as light, so that whoever believes in me may not remain in darkness." What's he telling us? It's pretty clear, isn't it? He's telling us that he is the light of the world, and he came so we wouldn't walk or remain. Remember, dwell, sit, stay, make our abode in darkness. Do you see the direct connection? He's saying, I'm the one. It's me, the one Isaiah told you about 700 years ago. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwell in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. He says, I'm here. And because I'm here, so is the light. You don't have to live in darkness anymore. Come out. Where does he do this? Zebulun and Naphtali. Why? Glory. He's doing something that makes no sense for his own glory. He's taking a cast-off, rebellious, forsaken people and redeeming them out of exile simply because they are his and because he set his love upon them. And as he delivers them, he will get glory for himself so that his children would know and so that all the other nations around them would know that he is the Lord. How will he do this? By coming himself. By entering the darkness of this fallen world in order to shine his glorious light, by giving this stubborn people the knowledge of his tender love in the face of Christ. That's why, upon the birth of Christ, Luke writes in chapter 1, verses 78 to 79, because of the tender mercy of our God, whereby the sunrise shall visit us from on high to give light to who? To those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death. Northern Alaskans count down the days until the sun peaks up over the horizon. We don't have to count the days. The sun has already risen over those of us who have chosen Christ. He, the very one who said, "Let there be light," came into the world as that light so that Israel, so that you, and so that I would never have to walk or dwell in darkness again. He knows the dark scares us. He knows we're not made for the dark. So what's our big takeaway today? Because of Christ, we get to walk and dwell in the light and say, "Goodbye, darkness, my old friend." The darkness was never our friend. In darkest night, you are close like no other. The same God who came to Israel's ground zero can come to yours and shine light into your oppressive darkness. I don't know what your darkness is today. It may be something from your past that still haunts you. It may be a temptation or a battle you're facing right now. You are not meant to remain in the dark, friend. What is it about the darkness that feels familiar, that calls you back, that makes you want to say, "Hello, darkness, my old friend"? Don't buy into the lie that darkness is your friend. You are not meant to make your home in the dark. Here's what Ephesians 5:8, another one of our cross-references, says about everyone who has responded to Christ by following him. For at one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. You're no longer in exile for your rebellion. You're not an assimilated Assyrian. You're not a member of the scorned tribes of Zebulun or Naphtali. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. If we fast forward another 3 years, the man who began his ministry in Galilee would now complete it on Calvary. Having fulfilled all of God's laws through his perfect life, the light of the world would now clothe himself in the darkness of our sin and have the wrath of God poured out on him instead of on us. Because of the darkness that Jesus took upon himself on the cross, a darkness we would have never been able to conquer on our own, we now get to walk in the light of the Lord. If you have chosen to follow Jesus by faith, he has declared that you are now a child of light. And what God declares always stands. Walk as a child of light. How do you walk as a child of light? We'll get into that next week in verse 3, which makes this a perfect time for me to invite you to begin working on the next 4 pages in your study workbook for Isaiah 9:3, pages 16 to 19. You'll also find a place to recap what you've learned so far in verses 1 through 3. This is an important step that helps you to move what you're learning into long-term memory, so don't skip it. This recap can be found on pages 20 to 21. Ideally, you would have these sections done before next week's episode, number 24, titled Sow in Tears, Reap with Joy. This episode will cover Isaiah 9:3, which says, "You have multiplied the nation, you have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as they are glad when they divide the spoil." We're going to learn how to walk as children of light in all seasons of life. And that's it for this episode. Thanks again for listening. I'd love to close us out in prayer and do our memory verse work together for Isaiah 9:2. As always, if you know someone who would be blessed by what you just heard, please share the Abidible Podcast with them. Drop a review if you can. Keep spreading the word so we can make much of the word. And please, only if you are able, consider becoming an Abidible Podcast partner for as little as $3 a month. Your support truly blesses us as we create this content. It's super easy to join, and you can cancel at any time. And all of our monthly subscribers are entered in our free study giveaway that we do each month. I'll link the details in this episode. Father, we want to walk as children of light. Thank you for seeing our plight in the dark and for calling us out of that place. We no longer have to walk or remain in darkness because you've shown your glorious light on our hearts in the face of Christ. Let it not be lost on us that the same God who said, "Let there be light" at the creation of the world also entered the world as light so that we could have the light of life. Forgive us for the times and the places when we still choose to walk in the dark. We are forgetful, and the former way of life can feel familiar. Yet you have done a new thing through your Son, who is the light of the world. Thank you for sending him so that we could be free to walk in the light. Teach us how to do that and empower us daily by your Spirit. May we choose the light. We ask these things in the name of Jesus, the one who is light. Amen. Let's close by doing our memory work together. I'll repeat Isaiah 9:2 5 times so you can say it out loud with me or quietly to yourself. Are you ready? The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. All right, friends, enjoy digging into verse 3, and remember, you are able to abide in the Bible. We'll see you next time. Until then, let's abide.